Columbia, I've seen your mountains high, seen your pretty rainbows and your blue crystal skies, watched your winding rivers as they flow around the bend. To me you're not a stranger, you'll always be a friend.
Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicoast. Today is August 9th, 2018, and this is episode 98. Politicoast is the BC Politics Podcast. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and leave us a review wherever you found us. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, where we're at PoliticoastPod, and support the show at patreon.com/Politicoast.
I'm Strad Leinboom.
And I'm Ian Bushfield. And today, we're joined by
David Moscrop.
Welcome back to the show, David.
Nice to be back.
We're going to talk to you about just how bad democracy is. Jagmeet Singh trying to run in a democratic election, and why we just went to war with Saudi Arabia, at least in words. First, though, big shout out to our premier sponsors as always, Lindsay Teds and Blake Hodson, for helping make the show possible. And Politicoast is in partnership with BC Today, British Columbia's daily newsletter, dedicated exclusively to BC politics. Sign up for a free trial to have unique coverage of the BC legislature delivered to your inbox every morning. Listeners, enter the offer code CITIZEN for access to a special rate. For your free 2-week trial, go to britishcolumbiatoday.ca. And a big announcement, I guess. It's sort of been telegraphed in advance, but our 100th show is confirmed. We're going to be at the Belmont in downtown Vancouver on Granville Street on August 23rd, 2 weeks from when we're recording this.
Can I come?
Yes.
Okay.
Please do come.
In fact, everyone should come. In fact, we should be one-upping your last live show for Cambie Report.
Yeah, Cambie Report, I think, had 65 to 70.
Okay. Well, let's aim for 100.
Yeah.
Well, I'll be there. It'll be my second last night. I'll be there.
All right. It'll be a send-off to Dave. Details for the show will be in our show notes. We'll put an event on Facebook that should be live tomorrow morning when this pod goes up. It'll also be on Eventbrite. We'll have the ability for you to give us $5 if you want to come, or you can come for free. I mean, we appreciate the money. It helps us afford to keep drinking while we do this. And we will announce our guests probably in the next week once we've confirmed them, which Scott and I have to talk about off air. Before we get into today's show, we got a ton of feedback from Mac Lockhart about our discussion on electoral reform. I don't know how much you want to go into, Scott, but so Mac's big complaint, I guess, and he's argued this on Twitter, is that STV is not technically a proportional system because it has ranked ballots and therefore is a bit more of a special case of alternate vote. Or
yeah, it's proportional-ish.
Yeah.
Like, it's that 95% solution that us engineers love, because it gets you effectively to the right place. You don't have to worry about that last little bit.
Well, and the first choice ballots tend to line up with what the people elected look like. But his point is you're losing information, because what if the second choices don't match up as well and we can't measure that as well? And it's a nuancy point that I don't think helps the discussion for electoral reform.
You know what? We can add the IHS suffix onto all the times we refer to STV as proportional from now on, because it's proportional-ish.
Mac's other comments are more about the examples we mentioned, some of which, the subtleties were wrong. Maybe we'll just copy the comments into the show notes, and if you're interested in his take, you can find them there. Let's jump into our first segment with you, Dave. Are we too dumb for democracy? Why do you hate people?
Well, that's a very different question from why do I think we might be too dumb for democracy, isn't it? I mean, so what I like about the question, are we too dumb for democracy, is that it's a provocation that leads me to be able to say that we're not. So the question is, okay, well, why bother asking? And the answer is, well, because we're encouraged to make dumb decisions all the time. We're encouraged to make dumb decisions because of the partisan nature of politics that want to put identity with party ahead of reflection, critical thinking, reason, because the environment in which we make political decisions is too fast, it's too full of information. We're never encouraged to try to get the answer right. We're encouraged to try to win. We're not asked to give each other reasons back and forth. We're asked just to raise our hand or to scream at one another until we decide to walk away because no one's going to convince anyone else. Or because we don't have a lot of practice doing democracy, right? I mean, think about the last time you actually took part in government. Now, the people listening to this podcast are probably a bit of a biased sample, but even still, liberal democracy asks almost nothing of people. It asks you to show up to cast a ballot every few years, municipally, federally, provincially, whatever it may be, and yet many people don't. A significant plurality of people don't. It asks you to respect the law, which people more or less do, but not always. It asks you to pay your taxes, which people grudgingly do, except for, unless they can try to game the system not to do it. And so we have very little day-to-day experience with democracy. And if I were to say to you, the listener, you, Scott, you, Ian, strap on some skates, go on the ice, and put a puck top left corner. Oh, and by the way, you hit the ice once every 4 years. You'd put in the stands, you'd be lucky not to take someone out. And that's what's happening with democracy. And so it's not that people don't have capacity. It's that we never exercise or encourage that capacity to be developed in such a way that people can get good at making sure that they know what they're choosing and why they're choosing it.
So it's a democratic muscle that we've just all let atrophy.
Or never built in the first place, right? So there's an assumption that democracy is good because it allows people to participate and get what they want. And I think that's important. But then, of course, we never ask people to carefully consider or encourage them to carefully consider what it is that they want or why. It's basically we've never asked them to turn out to even try to develop that muscle. It didn't have a chance to atrophy because it never got developed in the first place. But the expectation is there. And then we turn around and say, well, geez, people are too stupid for democracy. But they're not. It's that we've never given them a chance. And so what happens then is you get the pooling of authority, a pooling of power, a pooling of influence among a fairly small elite. And then people turn around and say, well, geez, we're worried that we're getting ripped off or we're not being represented or we don't have a chance to take part. And they've got a genuine beef there.
So it seems like politics is constantly churning over, you can't go 24 hours without something changing, it seems like. So in one sense, it seems like we're constantly bombarded with our democratic system. How does those two things interplay?
Yeah, so part of the challenge, I write about this in the book, which
I guess we should say, yeah.
Oh, yes.
You have a book coming.
The book
that's
is
why
coming out in March 2019 with Goose Lane Editions. It'll be available pretty much everywhere. It'll be in all the bookstores and available online. And it's meant to be a book for everyone. I wrote it so that anyone generally interested in politics or in political decision-making, democracy, can pick it up and read it and get something from it, I hope. And, the argument is what I've been talking about here, although it's much more enjoyable and a much greater adventure than me just talking about it. So do pick it up, $22.95. $19.95 as an ebook, which is quite reasonable. So one of the arguments I make is that the environment around us, what I call our milieu, is so inhospitable to good political decision making. In part because everything's really, really fast, and there's no time to reflect, and the volume of stuff coming at you is overwhelming. So even if you pay a lot of attention to politics and you're trained to think about this stuff in a particular way, it's still overwhelming. Even if you come to this ahead of time with a sort of intellectual map of the world so that it helps you navigate and sort the stuff that's coming at you, it's still really tough. I wake up in the morning and I read 3 newspapers and then a couple of magazines. And when I leave, I sometimes think I'm not sure how to fit all this together. And so, Dan Levitin writes about this a little bit in The Organized Mind, about how much information that we're now taking in. It's several times more than it was in the 1980s. And it's more than we can possibly process. And so what do people do? They look for shortcuts, right? They look for heuristics to help them manage information. Sometimes that works, but sometimes that leads you to structural bias. If you say, well, I'm just going to see what the insurance association says and I'll do what they say. Or I'm just going to see what my family, my mother, my father, my husband, or my wife says, because that's, I trust them, or my drunk uncle on Facebook, or, whatever it may be, or my party of choice. That effectively turns you into a vessel for someone else's political will rather than an active agent that's trying to determine your own political will.
So a lot of that speed of information is a very modern change. You talk about the difference between the 1980s and today. Does that suggest we were better at politics in the past, or were there just different challenges? Like, are you saying make politics great again?
Lesson number 1 when talking about politics is there is no golden age. And there's a lot about the contemporary liberal democracies that's worth celebrating, including the fact that in many ways, especially in a fairly diverse population, there's never been as much, at least formal political equality and inclusion than there is now, right? Even going all the way back. This is quite a remarkable and bold experiment. So that's a big deal. But I mean, at the same time, the sort of speed at which these debates are unfolding, I think, is definitely worse than in the 80s. So we're doing better on some things. They're more inclusive, but we're also more polarized. And we're also then probably encouraged to rely more and more on heuristics and to go back into sort of tribal affiliation rather than to think things through because there's just so much and there's no time. So it's probably worse in that sense. But that said, it's also better in all kinds of other sense that there's new things on the register. There are new people who are included in the discussion in ways they weren't included before. And that's good. The real question is, how do we build institutions that allow us to manage the speed and the volume and allow people a chance to effectively train, like to get better by practicing more at democracy day to day?
Well, it seems like, if anything, the institutions are just kind of buckling under the stress of this. And I think you really see in like the Ontario PC Party right now and a few others that are much more focused on just that 24-hour win than any sort of structural commitment to the institutions.
Yeah, so there's a few things there. I mean, one of them, what I'll start with, is that and the erosion of norms, and then I'll talk really quickly about people abandoning democracy when the going gets tough. But on the norms front, and you've been seeing this in the U.S. going way back. There's in a great book called "How Democracies Die" by Levitsky and Ziblatt. They talk about broadly about Trump, but it's also about the decline of American democracy. And their argument is basically, look, this has been happening for a long time, and it's in part because parties are ignoring norms, and they're breaking down what they call the soft guardrails of American democracy, just certain things you don't do, whether it's trying to ram through judges or to attack the press or to call into question the integrity of your opponents and to call them criminals and so on, and to chant for someone to be locked up, all of that stuff, which is, you can look at Trump and say, okay, fine, this is it. But the seeds of that go all the way back pretty much to the founding of the Republic. So, the norms are eroding, and you're seeing that in Ontario a little bit too. I mean, staff members clapping at the end of press conferences, that's not a small thing. Some people say, well, that's not a big story. Well, what it is the folding in of the civil service into effectively a partisan government, which is bad news. That's the Ba'athist regime in Iraq model, right? If you take it to its logical conclusion.
Well,
that's
and they literally launched Ontario News Now or whatever, like propaganda.
Yeah, and it reads like Pravda. It reads like Soviet-style newspapers.
2 years ago, these were the same people who are outraged. The foreign affairs staff clapped when Trudeau entered a room.
Exactly, and they were clapping to welcome him. This Ford thing, they're clapping to drown out reporters. So there's a whole different level of crazy to it and alarm. So there's that. That's the erosion of norms thing, and then of course that just encourages people to go deeper and deeper into their tribal commitment, into their partisan commitments rather. And then politics just becomes about bashing each other over the head until one of the opponent falls down, and it's over. But the other concern is, so there's the erosion of norms concern, but liberalism and capitalism work when there's abundance. We do fine when there's lots of stuff to go around.
I mean, communism also works when there's abundance. Like a lot of systems work really well.
Almost anything works when there's abundance, exactly. The period in which liberal democracy flourished was a period of for the most part, abundance. People forget, but liberal democracy wasn't confirmed in the West until after the Second World War, right? I mean, there was legitimate and serious pushbacks against it throughout Europe and North America, right up until the end of the Second World War. And in fact, it collapsed in Germany and it collapsed in Italy, right? And so there was no guarantee that democracy was going to be the global model and norm until after the Second World War. And then you had decolonization and the growth of democracy. And then, of course, the fall of the Soviet Union, and all those countries became democracies like Russia. But you're seeing now that people are starting to look at liberalism a little bit cockeyed because the going is getting a little bit tough. And so this experiment, which isn't that old all in all, is already showing signs that it might be going a bit pear-shaped. And so there's a concern, and my argument is if you don't bring people into the democracy now and give them a chance to participate and put a little skin in the game, when the going gets tough, they're just going to walk away and say, we want something else. And we want the goods to be delivered. We don't care what it is. We just want the goods to be delivered. And if you look at some Pew polling data recently about interest in other systems, autocracy, military rule, whatever it may be, technocracy, you can see people just want the goods delivered, like a significant number of them.
So before we look at maybe solutions and better ways to do things, what kind of got us here? Like, you raised a lot of the alarms of how countries are looking to non-democratic states. You're looking at sort of the erosion of norms. I mean, the easy way to ask it is why Trump, but why why Trump?
Well, who knows? I mean, it's. I think it is the logical conclusion of a political system based on winning that you end up finding people who are willing to abuse the rules to win, right? If you say politics is about putting up your hand and counting votes, and that's it, then people are going to find increasingly, let's say, dubious or questionable ways of doing that. They're going to keep pushing the boundaries as far as they can push them. And if you then attach capitalism to that and say, okay, well, we want it to be a democracy, but we also want it to be within a market system. And that market system allows the concentration of wealth and power and allows money to do a lot of that talking, including in Canada. Well, then you've got this unholy arrangement where you have people who will win at almost any cost within some very broad boundaries, and really powerful people who have resources who then align with them to try to facilitate that. And then it becomes a race to the bottom with power concentrated. And no wonder that in the US, if you look at the study from Gillens and Page a few years ago, basically says average people don't get the policies they want, wealthy people and wealthy special interests do. And that's not a democracy, that's an oligarchy, effectively. Certainly not an aristocracy. So it's a concentration of power and authority in the hands of the few. And you're seeing in Canada too. Who ends up becoming a politician? Who ends up in the boardrooms? And so I think over time people start to look at that and say, well, I think the system's rigged, especially when the going gets tough. So I do think it's in part the tension between liberalism, democracy, and capitalism has led to this point where we may not be able to sustain this without some pretty serious changes. And I mean, on top of it all, I mean, as if you weren't already despondent heading to the bar or to the fridge for another drink or looking at cat videos on the internet, when the going really gets tough, when the worst of climate change starts to hit, and there are droughts and resource food shortages, and there are regional tensions that grow, or energy shortages, or there's a refugee crisis on the 10 times as bad as Syria was, and people are flooding across the border to try to escape, a dust bowl or boiling lakes. Well, then what are we going to do? What's it going to look like then?
Well, what is the solution?
What are we going to do?
Right. So, I mean, I believe in participatory democracy and deliberation, and that means I want a democracy in which people day to day are taking part as much as they can or as much as they want and making some of those decisions and are given the resources to do that, because you can't just say you should participate. You also say, like, geez, we're going to make sure that you've got somewhere to put your kid, and we're going to make sure that you've got some money in order to facilitate that, and so on and so forth. Oh, and by the way, we're going to listen to you. We're not just going to democracy watch, and we're going to have this thing, and then when it's all said and done, we're going to do whatever we wanted anyway. So we're going to have this meaningful engagement. And so that's the participatory part. The deliberation part is simple. I believe that we should give each other reasons for and against things rather than just saying, this is what I want, let's put up our hands and vote. Maybe you try to convince someone, maybe you're just trying to communicate to them what you believe and why. But it's reason giving, and it recognizes the other person sitting across from you as a human being who has a history and who has preferences and who has values and desires. And you want to hear what that person has to say. You want to know where they come from, and you want to share that with them on your end. And then eventually you have to vote on most things because you're never going to get consensus on everything or even on most things. But people then say, oh, geez, okay, look, I understand where you're coming from now. I accept the outcome even if I don't love it. I don't just think you're out to destroy the fabric of the nation or to take my money. I see where this is coming from. And maybe you change some minds along the way. I want to build that into institutions. So one way to do it is through what we call citizens' assemblies. And we had one here in British Columbia in 2003, 2004. You bring a bunch of people together. You give them a period of time to learn about something, to make a decision, and then to communicate that decision. And then either it goes to policymakers who vote, or it goes to the people, and you vote in a referendum like we did on the electoral reform referendum in 2005.
So you're saying it's a mistake we didn't do it this time?
Oh, yes, I strongly preferred it. Yeah, I mean, I'm on the record going way back now saying that I strongly preferred that we have a citizens' assembly on this. For the simple reason that you can't just say, well, we did it 10, 15 years ago, and let's just use that, because people change, right? The population changes, things change. So, but
we're also not even using that because we've decided that system they came up with got rejected twice, even though it's with like asterisks.
Yeah, I mean, the first time 58% of people chose it, but they didn't get the 60% threshold. But you're right, and I think it was salvaged by having a referendum in which you had two questions where you could say, okay, look, do you want proportional representation, yes or no, and then you could pick a system, and then there's going to be a referendum a few electoral cycles or whatever it is, 10 years or 2 elections down the road, something like that, where you can decide to keep the system or not if it changes. But so the Citizens Assembly, I think, is a great model. Not for everything, but for some things.
We shouldn't set tax policy by Citizens Assembly, you're saying?
Well, what's funny is you maybe you
referendum.
could set, and you shouldn't set tax policy by referendum, but you'd be surprised what a Citizens Assembly can do. But even better than that, when it comes to financial affairs, participatory budgeting is another great way to do this. It's done throughout the world, typically at the municipal level, but you can scale it up easily enough. You can scale all this stuff up. You give citizens X% of the budget. It doesn't have to be that much. It usually isn't that much, but it's significant. So say 5% of the budget. And you say to them, you pick what you want to spend it on. And what governments are finding, and this was pioneered in Porto Alegre in Brazil, and then exported around the world, citizens get engaged, they build civic capacity, they build civic skills, and they invest in their communities. They want to build schools, they want to build clinics, they want to build parks, they want to build things that that the community is going to benefit from. And they find that it also builds trust and all kinds of other good things. So to come back around to my initial argument is that people aren't too dumb at all for democracy. When you give them a chance, they do a pretty impressive job, and they build all kinds of other public goods along with it, like civic capacity and trust and the rest of it. My argument is we need to do that, and we need to do it right now. That also means heavier redistribution, but that's just the cost of doing business.
So what is Canada doing right now that gives you hope and optimism? Like, are there specific
Nothing.
projects you're looking at?
No.
Okay.
I
Easy
mean,
answer.
Yeah. No, I mean, so Genevieve Fuji Johnson at Simon Fraser University, who's a political scientist, has a good book called Democratic Illusion, and she goes through a bunch of participatory democracy pilot programs or instances or whatever that you want to call them. And she finds that it does happen in Canada. And people are acting in good faith, including a lot of the people who convene them. Mm-hmm. But then something happens. There's no uptake, right? Everyone does a good job. Everyone's really into it. And then nothing ever comes of it. So we need to institutionalize it and make it regular. I mean, the worst thing is you don't want politicians seizing this as a tool for manipulation, for democracy washing, like the transit referendum that we had here a few years ago.
Yeah, well, that seems to be the big challenge is how do you get from this is an idea, the three of us are talking about to actually getting it in place, because the incentives for any government is to, not do that and keep the power to themselves.
Oh, yeah. And I should say really quickly, I was being a little bit flippant earlier. I mean, the citizens' assemblies, imagine that. Citizens' assemblies are used in Canada, and some of them quite. There was one in Grandview Woodlands. Toronto has got a few programs going on. There are a bunch of them. My critique is that, and you can look them up, there's a great website called Participedia, which is run by a bunch of scholars, including my former supervisor at the University of British Columbia, Mark Warren. It's a huge project, international project, and it's basically a Wikipedia of democratic innovation. And you can see all the kinds of democratic innovations that are going on around the world, including in Canada. So I don't want to say there's nothing going on in Canada. My frustration and criticism is that we aren't institutionalizing this at the federal or provincial or level, and we're not making it a normal thing. So there's that. I've never met a government that wanted to give power away. My argument would be that it is in their enlightened long-term self-interest to do this. Right?
And governments are well known for
well, and this might be it's funny is that might be the ultimate thing that undoes all of us. When I was writing my book, I talked to a really serious historian who's written about this stuff in the past, and he basically said one of the huge problems with democracy and capitalism is that the cycles are too short. They're just too short to do big things that we need to do to get the job done and to survive. Corporations are reporting their earnings like quarterly, or they're and they're expected to hit certain milestones, or the share price tanks, or they're planning a few years at a time because you never know what the environment's going to be like or what the regulations are going to be like. Governments are turning over quickly. You have elections every 4 or 5 years, depending on what it is, a couple of years in certain instances in the U.S. It's just too short because everyone is working for the weekend. And that catches up to you. And so how do you then deal with something like climate change, where you have to say we're going to make policy for 30, 40, 50 years down the road? And we've known for how long that we need to do that, for 30 years anyway. So, maybe even longer. It's been mainstream, probably generally accepted slightly less than that. Maybe, I don't know for sure. But long enough that we haven't been planning for it. So I choose to work to remain hopeful. But there is a chance that this is just a game of solitaire that we've lost from the dealing, right? I hope not.
Well,
But, what can you do?
so we've talked about a lot of the internal threats to the liberal democratic order, but we're also seeing external threats in a way. The stories that kind of pop up every couple weeks now are these Russian bots trying to meddle in our elections, and CBC just had an analysis done by some academics of a bunch of tweets that seem to be Russian bot fed, and it's hard to tell if those are just capturing a zeitgeist based on like the American fears and demonstrated collusion and corruption that's coming out of that whole situation, or if we have a legitimate fear in Canada that people will try to influence and meddle in our upcoming elections.
Put my Putin hat on, I'd see no reason not to also interfere in Canada.
Yeah, 100%. My understanding of the situation, I've done a little bit of work on this, academic work, which I do from time to time as part of my job.
Between the whiskeys and beers.
Yeah, and the shit posting online. The Putin project and the sort of illiberal democracy, as Russia sometimes called, project, is to undermine the Western liberal democratic endeavor. And that includes the United States, and that includes Canada, and that includes France, and that includes the NATO alliance, and so on and so forth. And it is just sow division and discord and to raise doubt within those countries and among them. And so 100% Canada's on that list, 100%. And the threat is really real. And I think we were slow to react to it. And we're moving on it now. There's some stuff in the works now, legislation or policy planning. But that's been talked about for a while. But this is, I think, a long-term existential threat. Not on its own, but when it intersects with everything else, right? The stuff we were talking about earlier. And I think it's going to be a very, very serious threat from Russia as well as China. China is also a threat. They have different ways of seeing the world and different ways of governing. And it's realpolitik, which is it's as old as Athens and Sparta. It's funny, it's because all of the tinfoil hat crowd, to some extent, is now being proven vindicated, I think just by accident. These days, every so often I have to do a double take when my gut says that can't possibly be true. If someone said to you, the NSA is spying on you and here's how they're doing it a couple of years ago, you'd have said, really, please do take off the tinfoil. And then, of course, we had Snowden. So
I can definitely agree that, the threat is out there. The frustrating thing is just like looking at the actual data that they released and looked at this, and they don't have the impact, but the kind of things that the trolls were going after didn't seem to like make an effect. Or, they would do things like try to capitalize on popular hashtags, like make a thing Canadian, where they would make really bad Mountie jokes or just like tacky stereotypical.
Make a TV show Canadian.
Yeah,
was
that one.
Example they used with, what was it, How I Met Your Mountie? Was what apparently one Russian bot tweeted.
And it's easy to laugh that away, right? And Scott and I talked about this before. That's sort of how they build a following. Sort of like, I think Britain First was really big at using just like generic, everyone would just share it kind of content on Facebook, and then people would be following it. And then when the white supremacist stuff came through, they'd be like, oh, this is just sort of influencing you dispassionately almost. So, but the kind of like controversies they tried to stir up, because I think the strategy here is, build that following and then lean in when there's a cultural wedge issue.
Yeah.
But they tried to like play US cultural issues almost into us. Like NHL players consider taking a knee during US anthem, which may not even, it doesn't matter if it was a real story, but it's also like, maybe it's just my own bias. Like, I don't care. But
I've run into a few people who would react to that.
Yeah,
Or is it just like too early to tell you?
I think it's too early to tell, but it does pollute the information space a little bit. It does make things a little bit more difficult for people. I saw in one of the CBC stories about this, Fenwick McKelvey from Concordia was talking. He's quite good and insightful, and he said, look, most of the country isn't on Twitter. People like us forget that, but most people have other things to do. God bless them. And so, thank God, right? I mean, thank God that's not where the whole country's getting their news, because that would make us even more susceptible to this. But they're on Facebook, and they're on YouTube. In fact, YouTube is one of the most significant, maybe the most significant platforms for a lot of people, including for disinformation. So it isn't just that it's happening on Twitter, it's that it's happening everywhere, and it's poisoning the information space. We're now facing deep fake video and audio.
Explain what that is for people who haven't heard of it, because it's terrifying.
It is. It is an AI technology that allows you to approximate the voice of pretty much anyone you want, and to make them through video say whatever they want, whatever you want them to say. Rather, you can stick them on someone else's head, like Obama's head on someone's body, and have them give a speech about whatever you want, and it's getting more and more convincing. And part of the issue is, people who stop and think will say, okay, well, that doesn't make any sense, and let me check that, and has it been reported by any news outlets? Okay, no. But a lot of people aren't going to do that work, or it's going to get shared 100,000 times before it gets corrected, and then the damage is done. Like, this is part of the old problem is the old line where the lie will make its way halfway around the world before the truth puts its pants on. Well, part of the problem is when people finally correct the lie, you're going to have a residual effect of people who believe it even once it's corrected, and that's going to be significant. And the deep fake is going to be really serious about that. And I've seen no evidence from any of the platforms to suggest that they're able and willing to tackle that problem, because they're not able and willing to tackle most problems, because it undermines their bottom line, which is the share value.
Maybe end this segment on something positive, since we kind of went dark there for a little bit.
I get that so often from people.
Well, you talked up some reasons you choose to be hopeful. You're moving to Ottawa.
Mm-hmm.
That's maybe not a reason to be hopeful, but what are you going to be doing there, and then where can people find your book? And
I'll be a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Communication at the University of Ottawa. I'll be working with Elizabeth Dubois, who does great work on Twitter and bots, actually. And she's going to be my supervisor there as I continue my academic career. And I'll be working on participatory democracy and the use of messenger apps and social media. I want to know who's doing what and why and what effect it has. So I'll be doing that. And the book, Too Dumb for Democracy, Why We Make Bad Political Decisions and How We Can Make Better Ones, will be available in March of 2019. And I'm very, very excited for it. And I'm quite proud of it. I think people will like it. So that'll be out soon enough. And in the meantime, I'll be columnizing on the internet plenty.
Okay, so you got picked up by the Washington Post recently, right?
Yes, I was made a what they call a contributing columnist at the Washington Post in the Global Opinions.
Canadian media not good enough for you?
Well, I love Canadian media, and I'm going to continue to write for them, especially Maclean's, who I also love. But I like being able to reach different audiences, and I like being able to make sure that there's always a home for what I have to say if there's something I have to say.
Moving on to segment 2, Jake Meat, Burnaby's new MP. The by-election that will be coming up because Kennedy Stewart's decided to run for mayor here in Vancouver has its first official entrant to it. One Jake Meat Singh has announced he's going to be seeking the NDP, will be running as the NDP candidate.
I like his chances of getting nominated.
Yeah, that's always funny. I think the NDP, because it's the NDP, will still run a nomination race.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
Where they basically have him come and meet, and then they go, he's in.
He's in, yeah.
But he had talked when he first got nominated or elected as leader of the party. It's not desperate that I get into the House of Commons. I want to find the right riding that I have deep connections to, that, represents my values, that my people maybe sort of, reflects.
Well, Burnaby South's well known for its proximity to Brampton.
But it seems more likely that as the NDP have kind of spun tires since that point, and maybe even fallen a little bit behind and just gotten utterly forgotten by the national press, people started yelling at him, Jagmeet, get into the House of Commons. And, Burnaby South wasn't the strongest NDP performance in the last election. I think Kennedy Stewart won it by about 500 to 600 votes. Mm-hmm. Given the way the winds are blowing, I think this is a safe seat with a place where if the NDP can't win Burnaby South, they're not going to do well at all in the next election.
They're probably not actually going to do all that well in the next election, but yeah, it's probably an NDP hold, even if you factor out the fact that it's a leader running there, just because of the pipeline issue and the Liberals.
Well, yeah, and I think that is worth sort of pausing on for a second. Like, the pipeline is divisive across BC, very supportive in Alberta. It's generally, like, the rest of Canada keeps talking about how BC is so anti-pipeline, but you look at the polling numbers and it's not actually that clear-cut. But Burnaby is a little bit different of a story because that's where the pipeline ends and that's where the protests are happening. So you will get starker feelings on it, but I think the strongest protests are coming from ridings like that in North, in Burnaby. And so Justin Trudeau's pushing this through, and some of his other sort of approaches, potentially like, reneging on electoral reform, which I think some of the New Democrats and Greens in that riding would have been frustrated by. And I think I've also heard the Greens aren't running a candidate in this by-election, which is
Someone mentioned it on Twitter, but I did a quick Google search after that, and I can't see the Greens making a single statement one way or the other on this by-election. So I think the fact that the writ hasn't been dropped yet means that, they actually just haven't decided yet. And
I mean, the Liberals don't even have a candidate yet. He has to run in this by-election, and he has to win. And I think he will, for the reasons you said. I mean, the Liberals, incumbent parties don't particularly perform well in by-elections as a very general, very rough rule. And I think you're right that there's a lot of anger in Burnaby that will motivate NDP supporters to turn out and try to stick it to the Liberals to make sure that they keep the seat. But I don't think it's naturally an NDP riding. And like you said, it was close in the last election. Singh, I put it this way, it's a good thing he's finally doing this. I think he should have done it 6 months ago.
I mean, we've looked back at this and talked about it a couple times on the podcast, on past episodes, what is Jagmeet been up to? And like one of the biggest stories he's gotten since being elected is when he got married. But I've kind of just had maybe it's more hope than reality that he is spending his time talking to the party, building up the base, rather than expanding the vote share, but really getting members in a way interested and excited and ready for the next election just through his listening tour. And he sent an email around which showed a little plane jumping around the country, and he's like, here's where all the places I've been, which is great as long as you don't think of it from the carbon and environmental perspective. But, it's trying to say he's doing all these things. And the flip side of that is I know a lot of NDP activists, none of whom are like, oh yeah, Jagmeet inspired us so much when he was in town. It's kind of just, stuck in neutral. So getting into Parliament was probably, as you say, like something he needed to do a while ago.
And to prove himself.
Yeah.
As a leader of the opposition.
Yeah, I don't have those kind of connections to the NDP that you do to hear that stuff, but like the sense I've got too is the exact same, that like not much has come out of that cross-country tour of his.
Yeah, that's the sense that I get. And I think, but with a giant asterisk, if he's come away from this saying, okay, I need to run a social democracy campaign, I need to do the Bernie Sanders campaign north or the Jeremy Corbyn campaign west, and that's what I'm going to do, then maybe this will pay off. I mean, it's a gambit for sure.
I think that's kind of just the general left-wing zeitgeist right now.
I think so too.
Just looking at it from an outsider, that seems to be the play you'd make if you're right now.
I think that's the obvious play. And I think it's been telegraphed a little bit with the speech in Burnaby the other day that was about pharmacare and a right to housing. And then the pipeline, because it has to be a little bit about the pipeline. But, I mean, I think if he runs the positive right campaign of, well, we need a right to housing, people need to be able to live somewhere, we need to have a universal pharmacare so nobody goes broke trying to pay for their cancer meds or whatever it may be, that he can capture some of that. And put it this way, why wouldn't you run that campaign at this point? Because you're not going to be able to convince people to vote for you over Justin Trudeau with anything but a very aggressive social democracy campaign. The best shot the NDP had was with Tom Mulcair, who ran a pretty safe, pretty dull, pretty ineffective campaign. If you run anything, and now you're in a weaker position, if you run anything near that, you're going to get clobbered.
Well, the Trudeau Liberals are looking at pharmacare, and they're starting to, and they talked about a right to housing in one of their new housing plans, and so they're mouthing the words without necessarily putting all of the backing there. but that's kind of telegraphing where their 2019 election campaign will be. It's going to be this weird split, I think, of here's all the progressive promises you've always wanted, pharmacare, housing, all this. Also, we're going to like ramp up border security and try and stave off the right. And
Yeah,
it's going to be the most
That's
liberal.
That's the liberal campaign, though, right? I mean, with a little bit maybe more of a nod to the right than usual, but that's a pretty typical liberal move.
Yeah, I think I think the Liberals are going to be fairly hawkish, kind of on foreign affairs and security issues.
People love them for it, though. You know, you're going to get a rally around Trudeau. You did with Saudi Arabia. You did with Trump.
Well, we'll come to Saudi Arabia in a bit, but the housing thing for Jagmeet to run on in Burnaby South is particularly interesting because Kennedy Stewart, as we mentioned, has officially stepped or is officially stepping. He's filed his resignation paper, but I think it takes effect in
September.
In September. So
15th.
what's the proper phrasing there? Like he's resigning.
Yeah, like
Yeah,
he
he's-
submitted the paperwork.
He submitted his resignation,
and, like,
but
which interestingly is like the day when nominations close here for mayor.
yeah, I think that's not a coincidence. That's on purpose. But
But full credit to him for doing it the right way, by the way. He did it the right way. Good for Kennedy Stewart for
not
getting
holding
all
on
the
to
way
both.
out. Yeah.
Unlike Leonard Krogh in Nanaimo, who's holding on to his MLA seat unless he wins the mayor.
Yeah. Well, and there's a long history of doing that, and I respect politicians who go all in on themselves. So full respect to Kennedy Stewart for that.
But so Kennedy Stewart has drawn a lot of criticism for his sort of lack of work or recognition of the housing crisis that's happening in his own constituency, the dem evictions around Metrotown, and a lot of this rapid development and gentrification that's really affecting affordable rental units. And so changing the MP from Kennedy, who's otherwise a popular MP and a very well-respected one, but is seen to have failed on this housing file, whether or not that's legitimate because the federal government has limited powers there, but to someone who's running on right to housing and really pushing forward to this kind of message could be a way for the NDP to justify taking that riding and also kind of clear up that issue. I mean, it doesn't help Kennedy's mayoral campaign at all, but that's a topic for my other podcast.
No, in fact, if anything, it looks a little bad that the guy from Ontario has a better sense of your riding's politics.
Well, and the timing's also worth noting. The riding's officially vacant in September. I think that gives Trudeau 6 months to call a by-election. So if he calls it at the end, that's then
March.
90 days after that the election actually happens, which puts, because you have to give it, or
It's 36 is the
okay.
minimum.
Yeah.
okay, so you can call it after the 9 months. And
Yeah, I mean,
About 90
it'd be-
days.
Kind of
you'd
put
be
it
in-
up.
You'd be into May for an election, by-election for an October general.
And given that the House would only be sitting for another month, then it
Yeah.
could Trudeau could be a huge dick about this.
Yeah, I hope very much that he calls it right away and gets to business. I mean, I think that would be the right. It would be petty and petulant for him not to call it right away, but I don't know.
Weird, stranger things have happened.
Yes.
But so Jagmeet's likely to win. We'll cover that when he eventually does. Or if he doesn't, it'll be really interesting. And then who knows, maybe we'll actually get him on the podcast since he'll be, a neighbor.
In fact, he'll be your MP when you move.
Very likely, assuming all that goes through. I mean, we haven't signed the paperwork or finalized paperwork, but the hope is that I'll be there in time to vote for him. Well, let's move on to our third and final segment before we go to the quick takes and talk about this war of Saud we've suddenly found ourselves in as, I don't even know what this fucking story is about. The Government of Canada's Foreign Affairs Department tweeted a mildly critical take on the fact Saudi Arabia imprisoned Samar Badawi, the sister of Raif, who's been in prison for years and is facing lashes for apostasy. Raif's wife has fled and is in Canada as a asylum seeker, and she's now a Canadian citizen. But so Raif's sister gets arrested for human rights campaigning and stuff like that, and they trumped up charges, all of the usual dictatorial stuff, and Canada goes, that's not very nice, on Twitter. And
Urges them to release them.
Yeah,
urges them to
this
release
is something Canada says to basically every country that has human rights issues.
And something the United Nations said, by the way, and using the
Norway said
exact
it
same words. Yeah.
like a month ago. Norway said
And
the same thing.
for
basically.
whatever reason, Saudi Arabia decides this is the hill they're going to die on. They kick out our ambassadors. One group within their government tweets this photo of like a Air Canada plane headed towards the CN Tower, potentially just meaning the ambassadors are on their way back, but is widely interpreted as we're going to 9/11 you again.
Yeah, if you're the country that 15 of the 19 hijackers came from, pause a moment and think about the imagery.
They deleted it and said, we didn't mean that.
Yeah.
But
That was a bad day for the social media intern.
But they've sort of gone beyond that and continued to do this like all-out internal war on Canada in their internal propaganda.
Well, not just internal propaganda. They're also instructed their asset managers to sell everything Canadian, no matter what the loss is going to be.
Yeah, at any cost. It's a fire sale.
Well, and they're also...
hey, we could probably buy the wheat board, like part of the wheat board shares back
can't,
cheaply.
what's interesting is you can't reconstitute the wheat board because of NAFTA.
But you could buy the shares cheaply.
But you could buy that back. Yeah, that's true.
Well, they're also cutting off any Saudi Arabian students who are in Canada. They're cutting off some of the medical coverage they give to
any patient, any Saudi Arabia patients basically being relocated out of Canada.
And it's like all these draconian measures over a tweet. And Canada, Chrystia Freeland and Justin Trudeau have stood firm and sort of redoubled on the criticism and said, no, we stand up for human rights. Yeah. And then the far right is taking a weird, like, moral relativist stand of who's Canada to tell Saudi Arabia how to be a human rights defender. Like the same people who are very quick to criticize Iran and other
they've just decided that in this case, Trudeau is
more reprehensible than the Wahhabis.
They dislike Trudeau more. That's all that's.
And then, some folks. So Aaron O'Toole had a pretty thoughtful response. I mean, I don't agree with him, but I think it was a thoughtful response in which he basically said, this doesn't help the cause of human rights campaigning on the ground. It doesn't help these people who are in prison. In fact, it probably makes things worse for them. And yet, if you look around, so Stephanie Carvin, who's a security expert, and a few others made the point that, but there's all kinds of policy tools that you use as well as Twitter, and as well as on the ground, boots on the ground diplomacy, and soft pressure, and a whole suite of tools. It's not like Canada just used Twitter. We have other things going on. And how could you possibly know that this was going to happen? Because like Scott said, you had Norway saying things. A little while back, years ago, Sweden had said something about, I can't remember who it was. It might have been Saudi Arabia, in fact. Incidentally, we didn't take their back at the time. The UN had used similar language, so how could you... And the answer is this. The Crown Prince is wildly insecure, plainly doesn't have full control of the regime, is trying to assert his authority and consolidate his power. He's weak. The future of the kingdom, to some extent, could be weak. I mean, it's bound up so much with the price of oil, and oil as a commodity. Even they're trying to diversify and move away from that, they know. Their legitimacy is questionable. This is the thing about autocracies, is that in a democracy, you get your legitimacy from an election. In an autocracy, you basically have to deliver the goods / repress. And if you start to lose the carrot or the stick, then the whole thing gets thrown into question. You get overreactions like this.
Well, yeah, that's what struck me about this was not how a country that is confident in its position reacts.
No.
It reminds me of some other leader just to the south of us. But what's interesting about the...
Which one's that?
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't think he's called any ambassadors.
He said there were very nice people on both sides of this debate. Or something to that effect.
So, look, a lot of people are saying there's some crucifixions. A lot of people are saying there's some crucifixions.
What's interesting about sort of the Crown Prince that you're mentioning, he, up until now, has had like an actual long string of good news stories, of sort of progressive news stories, of actually like, oh, look, women are allowed to drive for the first time in however long in Saudi Arabia. He's starting to loosen.
And he loved the foreign coverage then.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, he was kind of being portrayed as...
Modernizer.
Yeah, the modernizer. He'd come in and bring Saudi Arabia into the 19th century.
Well, and maybe there's some pressure internally to balance that, right? I mean, it could very well be. But again, on one of the days, I mean, that crucifixion joke I made was trying to get at something real. On one of the days where Saudi Arabia tried to criticize Canada's human rights record, they crucified somebody and beheaded them.
It's a little redundant, isn't it?
Well, it never hurts to double check your work, but it is beyond absurd. And so, my point is always that women can drive and fine. They should have been able to drive 100 years ago. You crucified and beheaded someone. You don't get any credit for anything else while you do that.
So the other question that this is renewed has been this arms deal that Canada has with Saudi Arabia to deliver light armored vehicles, which was sort of built under the Conservatives, and then the Liberals heavily criticized it, and then it turns out kept signing off papers when they said it was actually a done deal.
Yeah. Stéphane Dion said remember Stéphane Dion?
Yeah. Simpler days.
Yeah. Remember he couldn't make a video. Remember that debacle?
Oh, that was such a fun night.
We were all just sitting there waiting for Godot. He argued that we couldn't say no. It was done. It was too late. The deal was sealed, even though that was not true. And then later, John Manley, a former Liberal, disgraced himself by defending the deal and calling them something like fancy trucks, I believe was the word he
Jeeps?
used, or something like
Jeeps
that, or Jeeps, or
One of
something
them
like
said
that. It was some version of that, and this was the sort of the Liberal defense, broadly speaking.
But it turns out they actually have very heavy guns on them.
Like 25 millimeters.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's enough.
I heard someone else describe them as having seen it can fire off and tear a person apart at a good range, a couple hundred meters.
About 3K.
3K. So you shoot this gun off and it can explode a human at 3K. This is just a little gun. Jeeps with little guns. But the Liberals were...
an inch wide explosive round.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Jeeps. Okay.
Yeah. So we're giving those to the Saudis. Or not giving them. We're getting some money and jobs out of it. But maybe this will be the, straw that breaks the LAV back.
I mean, it is the height of hypocrisy. That deal could have been canceled. And it wasn't, because we were playing footsie with an autocratic, a theocratic regime.
Well, we needed those jobs in Southern Ontario.
A lot of ridings in Southern Ontario.
So what's the way out of this détente or whatever escalating situation? Are we inevitably going to end up at war with Saudi, sending our our old military equipment to fight our new military equipment?
That would be, let's be honest, that would be Gulf War I all over again.
Neither us nor the Saudis really have the capacity to deploy forces overseas.
We need to hitch a ride to get over there to have our jets.
We now actually have heavy lift transports that we didn't during Afghanistan, but it's still... Yeah. We really don't have the logistical train to do that by ourselves.
It's funny, is I'm not by disposition a nationalist, but when things like this happen, I become one very, very quickly. I have that same kind of deep, visceral, ancient, lizard brain reaction as everyone else.
You can still take it on as an internationalist, just saying they're not a healthy part of the internationalist order. It's sort of the paradox of tolerance. We're not going to tolerate the intolerant because it becomes self-defeating if we do. And if your internationalist order makes room for progressive regimes like Saudi Arabia, it's going to self-defeat.
Absolutely, and I promise I won't go all the way down the primrose path on this, but we could get into a utilitarian discussion about, is it better in the long run in terms of reducing suffering to starve one of these regimes, not literally, but basically to refuse to do business with one of these regimes until they collapse, versus trying to effectively prop them up and to play ball with them while we hope that they reform, right? This is the ultimate...
I'm not sure either of those have worked. We were doing one with North Korea, and in some ways they're starving themselves, but
yes, right.
We're doing the other stuff with some of the other regimes, and neither of them seem particularly effective.
Well, exactly. I think we just don't have a model for working on that, right? And this whole thing is irritating and hypocritical. People didn't have issues when Stephen Harper was doing this, right? On the right, I should say, conservatives had no problem saying that they were proud of Stephen Harper when he whispered to Putin that he needed to get a Crimea, or when he said that I'm going to talk about human rights with China. I supported Stephen Harper. I'm not a conservative. I supported him when he told Putin to get a Crimea. I supported him when he criticized China. As well. And he tweeted that. Of course he did. And good for him. I support 100% when he did it. And I wish that conservatives would support Trudeau now.
Moving on to quick takes. There are even more costs coming down the pipeline for, the pipeline.
The punishment. The punishment tonight.
So Trans Mountain announced they expect it's going to be another 1.9 billion more than the previous estimate.
Yeah, this came out of some modeling from Kinder Morgan. So they'd already plotted out that to finish building the expansion project, the federal government, since they're taking, or the government of Canada, since they're taking it over, will have to spend $12 billion or whatever on top of the 4.5 they're spending to buy the thing. Now I guess that's going to be 15 or whatever. And in situations like this, there's always plenty of blame to go around, and lo and behold, the BC Liberals are going to use every chance they can to blame the BC NDP for whatever obfuscation and delay tactics they're using, which I've still yet to figure out what actually are, because they filed a lawsuit that hasn't actually delayed anything. It's more protesters on the ground who are getting arrested these days, including grandmothers and priests, I think, have just gotten, like 70-year-old priests are getting arrested and put in jail. But yeah, the usual kind of partisan politicking and natural expected cost overruns of major infrastructure projects.
Look, if it does indeed end up costing $2 billion more, and there's some people who say that it might not actually, that's a worst case scenario stress test prediction, and it might not actually cost $2 billion more. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but that doesn't surprise me in the least. In fact, I'm not even that upset about it. You know, I had problems with us buying the pipeline. This to me just is par for the course. Maybe I've become a little bit cynical.
Well, it's one of those large numbers issues where once something is above something you can comprehend, it's like, what's another $2 billion? You know, I don't really know what $6 billion looks like.
But I mean, I guess
what's $8 billion?
I mean, I guess the question is funny is to put it in perspective. I mean, the Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives just released a report on inheritance taxes in Canada. We don't have one, not exactly. We have other similar taxes, but we don't have a proper inheritance tax. If we were to have one,
oh, we're going to get Lindsay Teds on to talk about that, I think.
my name might come up.
Yeah. No, I think it's a worthwhile topic to explore.
I wish I could talk to her about it, because I mean Lindsay's brilliant and I really respect her. I mean, I have a different approach to inheritance tax than some of the folks I talk to, including economists, but I understand the perspective that they take, and I appreciate it. But if we had an inheritance tax of 45% on estates $5 million and above, that would bring in about $2 billion a year, to give you some perspective of what $2 billion looks like. But I think the point is it still worth the $2 billion to generate a return that's going to be presumably greater than that? And I think the answer is yes. So what are we really talking when you look at this in the long run? It's not, to me, a big deal. It's the environmental impact and the threat to Indigenous peoples who don't want this. That's the issue. I mean, I think it's still an economically viable project. I wish it wasn't. I don't think it should be, because of climate and because of Indigenous peoples, but there it is, and I don't think it's ultimately enough to say that the project's not worth doing.
Yeah, so for context, it's about enough money to build 10 to 15 kilometers more SkyTrain track.
There was actually even more
UBC and beyond.
Probably going to cost a little more because it's all tunneled.
Right.
Yeah, more like to Langley.
The
and beyond.
the extension that gets you not quite halfway there is costing 6.2.
But maybe more directly, like, rather than compare pipelines to SkyTrains, BC Today had a feature about or a little side note about a solar project, the world's largest, I think, that's ever been completed, was completed in India in the last week or something. And that one cost something like $650 million, which is friggin' pennies for like a major infrastructure project.
So this gets at the heart of the matter, and my argument about the pipeline was every dollar spent on the pipeline is a dollar that would have been better spent on something else, right? It's the opportunity cost of the resources, the time, and the attention that I wish we had been putting into something else. And I get that there's arguments like, well, we have an energy demand, we have a although we want to ship this isn't for us, this is the ship, or we need to preserve jobs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. My position is always, well, wouldn't you like jobs 100 years from now? Wouldn't you like to be able to, if you have Pacific beachfront property in Manitoba, then talking about jobs seems a little bit silly.
No, but you see, this is just going to create more jobs because now we have to build a bunch of seawalls.
So there's J.G. Ballard wrote a book about this way, way, way back, which is basically a post-apocalyptic world that has been fully flooded. I was reading it recently, and that's all I could think of.
Well, let's move from there. And
can't wait for this.
I don't know
segue.
exactly what the segue from pipelines to cars is? Well,
They run on gas.
yeah, they
That's
run on
the
gas.
segue.
You know what runs on gas? Cars. You know what cars are doing? They're running too many red lights in Vancouver, as any pedestrian, cyclist, or
Nice.
even
Nice.
friggin' driver knows. And I think we've talked about before on the podcast why BC's red light camera system is really stupid, but it's so stupid it's worth reiterating. We have these red light cameras across the province, mostly in Metro Van, at a number of key intersections, but they would only run for 6 to 12 hours a day because it turned out the tape they used to record would fill up after that amount of time, and then they'd have to go and pick up the tape. Eventually, they smartly switched to digital, but didn't change the policy of how long they left the cameras on.
It's a great moment of bureaucratic inertia for you.
It was Betamax. They went from Betamax to Blu-ray, and now they're just going full Netflix.
But they've just announced they're changing all these cameras over to 24 hours. There's 140 intersections across the province that are being affected. And the hope is this will remind people that maybe you should stop when the light turns yellow instead of go double fast, because you can still squeeze 2 more cars through a red.
Yeah, no, that's the ever-present problem. Joked in the past before that you should probably fund our entire region's transit infrastructure just by taking that third car that tries to make the left on the red.
The other thing that happened today, why cars are really in the news, is that David Eby announced the changes to ICBC that are coming through, and they basically match what had been suggested in advance and what most of the people who looked at the consultation said, yeah, that seems like the most reasonable thing. It's that people who have gotten in collisions will pay more, and people who haven't will pay less. Overall, the goal is to keep it revenue neutral, so it's not an effort to...
Fits the giant hole in the ICBC budget.
But they were releasing stats there that there's something like 900 collisions a day in the province, which is a lot of car crashes, which means a lot of money coming out of ICBC, which means some drastic changes are necessary. One of the nice things that did come out of this recommendation and these changes that are coming out is that instead of the insurance being tied to the car, it's going to be tied to the driver, which it's not a car that causes a collision generally. I mean, if you have faulty brakes, but then that's usually still the responsibility of the person driving it.
Or your Tesla autopilot malfunctions.
Well, yeah, that'll be a whole...
Why would it ever have been anything but the person?
Just because...
Administratively
we
Right.
register cars, and so then you just tie the insurance to the registration. It's not actually that intelligent.
No, because I mean, if it's to the driver, then the driver gets in whatever car the driver gets in.
So we register drivers. Like that's the whole license.
Well, exactly. I find this very interesting because I find that the concept of insurance and the concept of third-party liability to be very, very interesting. There are these ideas that we just come up with that enable us to do things we wouldn't otherwise be able to do, and it's fascinating that someone decided one day that they were going to create this concept of third-party liability, and it enabled an entirely different world than existed before. Isn't that great?
Well, something else that was just entirely created ad hoc was the Agricultural Land Reserve.
Nice.
And
The segues are strong tonight.
well, some of them. That one worked a little bit better.
It'll sound even better once this is edited.
Yeah, that's always the point. But another report that came out in the last couple days was from a committee that was created in January to find ways to more efficiently manage the Agricultural Land Reserve in BC, which is the land that the Dave Barrett government set aside for farmland and that no government since has touched, which has turned out to be a pretty popular thing, especially in the Lower Mainland where we have a lot of fertile farmland. But it's also very desirable for mansions. And that's become a problem where in Richmond, some people have started building mansions on their farmland.
Won't someone please think of the millionaires?
Well, so this report recommends that the Agricultural Land Commission, which is in charge of the ALR, change to, and for some reason it's not already, an agricultural first model and policy. For some reason, I guess it's got multiple competing priorities that aren't agriculture for the Agricultural Land Reserve and Commission.
Yeah, I think there's like 2 tiers of ALR land.
Yeah, this is something the Greens
this is like
have been heavily
everything should be
critical.
agriculture first rather than agriculture and agriculture but less so.
Which creates a loophole that then people can say, oh, actually, I need to build my farmhouse with like 8 bedrooms and an 8-car garage and all this kind
Make
of stuff.
tractor garage.
So this puts in
And you know what tractors use? Gas.
Oh, diesel. but same thing.
Yeah. Fuel.
The recommendations also include a number of ways to curb that kind of speculation. And interestingly, but not that surprisingly, it also raises significant concerns about how the legalization of cannabis needs to be dealt with carefully on the agricultural land reserve. And I think the government's already preemptively done some of these things, but the fear is that because cannabis will be such a boom cash crop for the first 6 months before the market probably crashes and then stabilizes, they don't want all the ALR land becoming cannabis cultivation greenhouses that then makes it, especially if they build a greenhouse with a paved floor, that you then need to do a lot of work.
Floor seems a little more reasonable than we don't want too much of this one type of agriculture to happen here, which strikes me as a little too much micromanaging. Fine, don't pave the ALR to grow pot, but fine, just grow it on the natural soil.
I think the purpose of the ALR was to preserve food land. So for the same reason you wouldn't want them growing tobacco or, I don't know, other plants that aren't edible. You want to kind of preserve it for strawberries.
We should get someone on who actually knows.
Hey, marijuana is edible.
Mix it. But the one thing that's drawn some criticism is the recommendations suggested eliminating regional panels. So the ALR has a number of regions where local representatives are able to direct how they operate there. And I guess this was viewed as kind of maybe too much management. And the BC Liberals were the ones kind of standing up for local decision making. And so I don't know the full details of ALR policy, but I found that sort of pushback interesting because it's often the center-right government that gets in and centralizes. I know that happened in Alberta with the health regions. They went, let's have a super region that's the entire province. And now they've realized that was terrible and they've started breaking it up. And so the idea of reducing some of the local oversight.
Yeah, there's also a preference among the right to have local control over stuff. So it's not entirely coherent, but there is that strain of thought there. So I can see where it comes from. Well, there's no segue for this, but there's been some news out of the U.S. on their latest military changes with the announcement that the Space Force is in fact going to be a thing. And Vice President Pence made the announcement today that they are actually have directed the U.S. Defense Department to create a sixth branch of the military.
You know, finally we have a way to take all the debris of war and to shoot it up out past the atmosphere and then to have it fall on us. Outstanding. Very well done, humanity.
I'm slowly working my way through James Bond movies, and I'm not yet to the Roger Moore one, but I have watched Moonraker in the past, and it's terrible. So bad, but I may just even rewatch it and just go, you know what would have prevented all of this? A Space Force.
Yeah, it may actually be the most realistic Bond movie after this. But...
you just want to laugh at it, and then you realize that it will ignite a Cold War arms race once again. I mean, maybe that's already happening to a certain extent because Russia's been on it with this supersonic weapon that Putin's been talking about, but this is just going to make it 10 times worse.
Yeah, space is already militarized. Maybe we don't have weapons up there, but you have communication satellites, navigation satellites, intelligence satellites. There is military infrastructure in space. The U.S., China, Russia, they have anti-satellite weapons. Pence is right that space is a war-fighting domain, and Trump was right when he said it too, although I don't think he could actually explain the concept. But, the only reason we actually haven't fought a war that involves space is simply because there hasn't been a great power war between spacefaring countries.
Right.
I mean, there have been a few treaties signed through the UN that people would actively not militarize space.
Yeah, and
those are sort of an honor system, like all UN treaties.
Yeah, and
like UN human rights, according to Saudi Arabia.
Even if we don't have even if there aren't weapons up there now, the countries can take out satellites from their ground-based system. So it's sits in one, half dozen in the other. So in that sense, from should NATO be thinking about space operations? Yes, and in fact they have. And there's even a United States Air Force Space Command that does everything that this is going to do, just with less overhead, and they don't have a 4-star general and a giant staff that comes with being its own branch. It's just a way to waste money.
Well, but it's, policy and politics by shiny brands, and with this, Trump's running like a logo contest for his own mailing list of supporters, and
Yeah, we'll link to the images of these because they are hilarious. One, they basically just took the NASA logo, made it red, and wrote Space Force over it. Another one basically is talking about going to Mars, which makes me wonder, does Trump think the Space Force is there to invade Mars? The whole thing makes very little sense.
I would not be surprised if this is a guy who thought that Mars Attacks was a documentary.
Yeah,
though, right?
it's So it's a red logo with a spaceship flying up, and just says Mars awaits on it.
Oh.
It's not great audio here, but I'm showing the
you
images
should look
to
at these.
everyone
It
else.
looks a bit like a
post it.
badge you would earn an Untapped, the beer app,
or any 8-bit game.
or any 8-bit answer.
But other politicians known for their policy by, I don't know, tacky tagline include Doug Ford, which has made some people just kind of roll their eyes to the point of saying, why don't we just break the fuck away? And that's what one of the first people to come forward to challenge John Tory for the upcoming Toronto mayoral election, Jennifer Keesmuth,
Yes.
has said she wants to have Toronto secede from the province of Ontario, which is mostly in response to him, Doug Ford, arguing that and putting forward legislation to cut the size of Toronto City Council in half. Of course, Toronto has no constitutional ability to do that and would require Doug Ford specifically to approve it, and then also 6 other provinces probably.
Yeah, I suppose in theory
create a
you could
province.
get every other province to say yes and create a new province that way, but it'd be complicated.
But they'd also have to probably change the Municipal Government Act in Ontario. I don't know. It gets complicated, and it's more a...
I mean, everyone said it's impossible, and she doubled down on it to say that no, I slept on it, and she tweeted this. I slept on it, and why shouldn't we secede? And look, what irritated me about it was I think it distracted from legitimate election issues that we should be discussing in the short term. There was some pushback from some activist communities who said, actually, we've been talking about stuff like this for a long time because we don't think that we're being served particularly well right now in this particular arrangement in Ontario. But I don't think that's what Kismet was on about. And so I think it was silly and distracting and mostly a waste of everyone's time. She's now backed away. Now she's focusing, and she's running great guns now. Now she's talking about housing, and now she's talking about affordability, and now she's coming around and is running a much more serious campaign, and it looks a sort of effective campaign too. But that was a pretty disgraceful start.
Well, it's always interesting to see how these sort of regional sovereigntist movements tend to come from a small area that tends to be more economically well off than the rest. Like you have Barcelona versus Spain. You have Scotland at the time when they were ripe with oil money versus the UK. And then like right after the referendum, the oil prices tanked and they were like, whew. But I guess, you have some counter examples of like Quebec and just general cultural grievances. But even Alberta and Western separatism was often we're not being served and we're the rich ones. Why are we subsidizing Quebec from all those people who don't understand how equalization payments work? And so Toronto wanting to create a city-state outside of the rest of Ontario, it's actually surprising it hasn't been talked about more.
Yeah, and there's a lot of problems cities face that they are very limited in their responses just as they're delegated powers by the province, and that really constrains actions on stuff. To take a local example here, there's a lot of talk about the effects of money laundering in the local real estate market here, and whether or not one thinks that's a serious problem or not a serious problem at all. The fact is, the city basically can't do anything about it with the tools it has, and there's a whole bunch of other stuff. It's limited to property taxes is the only way to raise revenue, which also limits what it can do. There's a lot of limitations on cities. So while I don't like what Doug Ford is doing isn't a particularly great way to start the conversation off, there's some valid concerns and a decent argument that cities maybe actually should have a place in the Constitution.
100%. We're in a really weird historical period where cities have no status in the Constitution. They're what's known as creatures of the province. They exist at the grace of the province. and yet their responsibilities are growing, their significance is growing, urbanization is making them more and more important. Our lives happen here. They're leading on all kinds of areas, including on climate change, for instance. They're burdened with all kinds of things, but they often get downloaded responsibilities that they can't afford because the politicians at the provincial level want to say, you make it, you fix it, because perhaps politicians at the federal level have downloaded it to the province. And yet they don't have the constitutional tools and bandwidth to do what they need to do. So, full stop, they should be recognized in the Constitution. But
that also takes a constitutional amendment.
Well, I was going to say, yeah, it's also not going to happen. But lots of good things should happen and won't.
Well, let's close off this super extended episode.
I'm sorry. Every time I'm on, I just...
So...
It's good.
All right, good.
Here's what will probably happen for regular listeners out there. You're probably going to hear a more reasonable length episode. And if you want to hear the full uncut but still edited version, that'll be on our Patreon. Moving into the last bit for Best of BC Poly this week, I just want to shout out this one article in the Vancouver Sun, which was very random, and it came from a very random circumstance, where senior to retired journalist Larry Pinn describes his experience on a 7-hour plane ride. I think there was some delays that caused this, where he sat next to John Horgan, and they just talked the entire time. And they kind of note how interesting this is, because they're both sitting in economy class, whereas a lot of other very recent BC premiers were criticized for maybe using more private jets rather than economy class on Air Canada or WestJet. I don't actually know which flight it was on. But, it's an interesting take on the human side of John Horgan, which is always fun to see, and sort of the impromptu way that journalists have to operate. And you were talking actually before we started, Dave, about how as a freelancer you almost are always on and thinking about the next pitch and maybe your next plane ride. I took a flight to Ottawa where Elizabeth May was sat next to me randomly, and so you never know who you'll be stuck on the plane with.
Well, I'll be living in Ottawa by the time shortly after this airs, I would imagine. And every time you turn around in Ottawa, you run. I was at a Sobeys, and I ran into a prominent conservative MP, at the Sobeys when I was trying to buy a 6-pack. You just can't go anywhere in Ottawa. And so, it's interesting because everything all of a sudden becomes possibly a story, which is a tough way to live sometimes. Sometimes it's okay just to enjoy the ride, quite literally. But anyways, it's a different conversation.
Before we close off tonight, just a quick reminder about the live show. Have that coming up on the 23rd at the Belmont. Doors will open at 7 p.m. We'll have links to the Facebook event and Eventbrite in the show notes. So please do come.
There will probably also be an announcement about the next Canby Report live show, which is probably going to be on the Tuesday of that week. So I'm going to be hella busy podcasting in person. Come out to both of those. Dave, do you want to give a final shout out to where people can find you?
Absolutely. You can find me on Twitter at David_Moscrop. On Facebook, David maybe_Moscrop.
Just Google.
You can Google. My face will come up. And if you're in Ottawa, you can find me in Ottawa at the Sobeys buying a 6-pack.
And that has been Politos. Find links to the stories we mentioned in the show notes at PolitosPod. Make sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at PolitosPod. Give us a review and let us know what you think. Support the show and get early access to our interviews at patreon.com/Politos. And if you have ideas for the show, feel free to send them to us. Thanks for listening.